All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Can everybody hear me clearly? Can give me some thumbs up, please? Yeah, we are live. All right. Welcome to today's conversation on artificial intelligence. We have some amazing panelists. Some of them individuals I've known for a long time. Some I'm getting to know as we started preparing for this. I think we're going to have a cracker of a conversation today. We people here who are not going to shy away from saying bold things, hopefully. So yeah, and send us your questions. There's a chat feature there. We had a little polling situation today, so we don't have polls, but I would love to see also, people in the audience, like if you are part of an international development organization, if you're part of industry, if you're part of government, if you're part of an NGO, just type NGO, IDO, government, etc. Just love to get a feel for who do we have in the audience. And the topic today is going to be artificial intelligence or AI. Is it going to build bridges, create barriers for diversity, equity, and inclusion when it comes to international development? So I have some great panelists with me, and I couldn't be thankful for them to agree to join this panel. We have Dr. Shachee Doshi. She is the acting team lead for USAID's Bureau of Development, Democracy, and Innovation. And soon you'll hear all the good things she has done for AI in the context of USAID and international development. We have Alexis Bonnell. She is a senior industry fellow for KRACH Institute for Technology Diplomacy at Purdue. She was formerly at Google, prior to that USAID, so very diverse experience set as well. We have Dr. Emmanuel Letouzé. He's the director and co-founder of DATA-POP Alliance. I've known Manu. He goes by Manu for a long, long time. Delighted to see him. He's joining with us from Barcelona, Spain. Manu, thank you. And we were also expecting Marelize Gorgens to join from the World Bank Group. I'm not sure if she has technical difficulties, but we'll get started. Marelize is a lead for the Global Digital Health, which is a flagship program of the World Bank. I believe she just joined. And she's also done a lot of thinking and work around AI in the context of health and international development. So Marelize, thank you for joining. And last but not the least, Adarsh Desai, some people call me AD, part of the Deloitte team focused on international development and AI. Delighted to be here. So let's start with a quick warm-up round, right? Quick answers, very short answers. And I will start with Alexis. Alexis, if you had an AI superpower, what would it be?
Oh, goodness. If I had an AI superpower, I think it would just be being able to understand any language at any moment from any time, right? And just be able to kind of easily go in and out of the world with that ability to talk to anyone and understand anything. That would be mine.
All right. I love it. I'm going to go same question, AI superpower to Shachee.
I wish I could change mine to Alexis. That sounds so nice. But we can talk about why that's so hard to do later. I think for me, it would be, quote unquote, the power of sight. I think the biggest thing that AI gives us is the ability to make sense of lots of different types of information that we as humans just can't draw any patterns or any sort of, directions out of. Whereas AI can, and sometimes gives us some meaningful insights that would otherwise have been lost. So I feel like it gives us the power of sight where we're blind.
All right. So we got language, you got sight. Manu, what are you going with?
Well, I guess a combination of both. Half jokingly, it would be the ability to read all the white papers and reports that have been published about, big data and AI that have never been read by anyone. And so, yeah, it would be that ability to read and synthesize those reports that have been sitting on shelf for many, many years.
Wouldn't we all love that? Yeah, all right. I couldn't agree more with that as well. So Marelize, how about you?
Darsh, I'm going to be very practical and say that I would love to have, for every human being on Earth, to have one place where all their health data is readily available from birth to old age, every medical treatment, every supplement they've ever taken, and we have a unique personalized plan to increase people's lifespan, health span, and joy span. That would be my dream for AI.
All right, thank you, everybody. Can't top that, Marelize. I was going to say something very trivial and selfish, so I'm not going to say it after that. So, all right, we'll move to the next one. Another rapid fire, just warm-up question. As people start trickling in, we'll get into more substance. So one more, and then we'll start with the good stuff. Okay. AI in personal life, what kind of AI do you use the most? And I'll go in the reverse order. Marelize, let's start with you.
Illicit.org. I use it virtually on a daily basis. It summarizes based on any question you ask it. It summarizes academic research findings. It takes a one-page abstract and it summarizes into 1 or 2 sentences. It has literally changed the way in which I approach research assistants and any literature review. Illicit.org is the place I always start.
All right, Manu, I think that's what you're looking for. So now you got your superpower. All right, I'll go to Shachee next. Shachee, AI you use a lot in your personal life.
I have to go with Alexis' dream here. And actually, I use Google Translate a lot. You know, I work in international development and we travel quite a bit, and Google Translate and other translate services, but actually Google's is the one I use the most, are so helpful. You know, when you're in a country and you are having trouble communicating, I've found that even though it's not perfect, it can help you communicate, which is fantastic.
All right, Google Translate for you. All right, Manu, how about you?
So I would say 2 things, and actually, so one would be just Google Map, and then maybe the question is, you know, what is AI? I mean, is it AI? I mean, I think it is AI. And actually, the second one would also be translation services. So I was going to go, well, Google Translate is, of course, a very good one. I was going to go with DeepL, or DeepL, I don't know how to pronounce it, but yeah, it's been pretty amazing to just drop entire PowerPoints in French, English, or Spanish, or yeah, and have them turn into, and having to do few tweaks. And you've seen the improvements pretty quickly over the years. So yeah, it's quite transformative.
All right, and Alexis, same question for you.
Yeah, I think at some levels, I want to pay tribute to all of the AI that's being used all around me, kind of in my behalf, but that I'm probably less aware of. So whether that is, you know, keeping spam out of my email, whether that is, you know, alerting me to financial, you know, keeping my kind of finances safe, whether that is curbside, right, and being able to not have to cook, you know, whether that is even weather, you know, information. So I think there's all of that in many cases I take for granted. Maybe my more active use is I'm just having a whale of a time right now with Bard and with ChatGPT. As an example, you know, I was working on something for a customer, and quite frankly, it's really changed my relationship between the idea of seeing myself as always having to be a creator versus a curator, right? And it's really letting me curate and apply my experience, right, and my technical expertise, et cetera, but in that role of curation and being more permeable to larger information. And you know, I won't give myself away too much, but I just did something for a customer that quite frankly would have taken me about 2 weeks of 8 hours a day writing. And I ended up with that kind of 25-page plan in about 5 hours of work yesterday. And quite frankly, it's pretty good. So I think that, you know, that's really part of my awakening right now, and in that transition of role from only thinking about myself as my value as creating to also seeing me exercise my value as a curator of knowledge.
I think that all great answers, and Alexis, great segue, right? And the reason we start with warm-up is give some time for us to warm up, people trickle down, but also to talk about, there are lots of things that there are people on the spectrum I meet on a daily basis. Some are like, I love AI, it's going to change everything. And then people like, I hate AI, like I think humanity is going to lose all the knowledge that they used to have. And then there are lots of people in between, but a lot of people, whether we know it or not, don't realize that there's so much AI already in day-to-day lives. If you do search, if you call ride hailing, if you do smart speakers, all the other examples you guys started. AI is in a lot of things that we sometimes don't know about or take it for granted, but there's a lot of AI in lots of places. It's no longer science fiction, right? And we know it's only going to grow. So that's kind of a good segue into the next set of topics, right? So today's conversation, we're going to kind of break it down into 3 themes, if you will, right? One, AI in the international development. A lot of people on the panel here who are passionate about it, like international development, and have done a lot of thinking and work on AI. Then we're going to talk about AI and how does government operate, right? International development is about, a lot of it is about working with the public sector government. And third is, a lot of AI is being driven by the private sector. So how does private sector, government, international, all kind of work together in this space, and what are respective roles of different players, right? So everybody has a role to play. So again, I'll start with a maybe somewhat softer question on, and for every question, I may not go to all of you, right, depending on how the time is, but let's start with one where I want to get a feel for where one example where you've seen AI like really been purposefully positively impacting the world of international development, right? So one example, and I will start with Shachee. Shachee, go for it, please.
Yeah, I think I would put this into a category of examples, AD, that I've seen in the work at USAID, and I think it's really trying to do resource optimization, right? That's something that AI has been very helpful for. So whether it's in the health space, where we have limited resources, limited frontline healthcare workers, and lots of people who need frontline care services, triaging can be hard. And something like AI can be very helpful at helping to identify which patients should there be targeted service delivery for, where those limited resources should be focused on, and where they should not. So for example, we have a couple of projects at USAID that use AI to predict loss to follow-up, right? Which patients are going to be less likely to come to their next appointment. And then how should we be targeting our resources to make sure that we get those people, because it's very important that they come to their next appointment, whether it's for HIV care, they need to get a course of medications, or for tuberculosis care, where they need to get a course of medications. So it can really be a good way to optimize the resources that we're putting in so that we don't lose that end result that we're trying to drive towards. So I'll stop there. There are others, but I know you wanted one.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate you. There is going to be lots of opportunity to talk more about other examples. And I think I just want to encourage that as we go through it, some of the topics may be a little conceptual sometimes. So again, as in when you can introduce an example, that would also always make things a little bit concrete. Also, for people listening to this, I appreciate you joining. If you have, we'll try to keep some time to get some questions from the audience also. So as we go through it, if you have some pressing question, I won't promise we'll be able to take everybody's question, because I think there are a lot of people online, and thankfully so. But please do send, and we have people monitoring it. We'll be kind of filtering down to me, and then I'll pick some questions and try as best as I can. So maybe I'll go to Marelize also. Marelize, in your work at the World Bank, you have a long career in the international development space. Any example that really feels like promising, or that you feel like this is how it should be?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, Adarsh, and I think the answer depends very much on the context that we're in. And I really want to pay homage to this concept that what looks like a fantastic example in one country may not be achievable or realistic in another country, right? I think whenever we talk AI, it's like the most advanced technology is what we sometimes tend to focus on, or the most advanced use cases. We know IBM's Dr. Watson struggled, right? Because we started with AI, with a clinical decision support system in oncology, which is by far one of the more complex areas of curative care. So, I think we sometimes make that same mistake, right? I think some of the most powerful use cases are not necessarily the most technologically disruptive, but they make a big difference by just doing a few basic things right. So that said, the example that I want to mention is actually from the education sector, where we used a machine learning algorithm in much the same way as Shachee described it, to identify which households are most likely to have adolescent girls who are not in school, who we want to target with a program to put them back in school, right? No, that's not, I mean, it's a prediction algorithm. It used a decision tree. It's not even a neural network or a very advanced algorithm, but it really made a difference because it enabled the team who did the work to halve the money that it would cost them to identify those households. Because in the past, they would have had to go from household to household, and their hit rate of finding a young woman who's not in school may have been 1 in 10. By identifying the right households, their hit rate increased to 1 in 3 or 1 in 2, which meant the same number of people could go to fewer households and will get participants enrolled in the program that much quicker. And I think that's some of the ways in which we're not looking at AI for radiology or diagnosing diabetic retinopathy, but we're really using the technology in a way that makes a practical, real life difference for a lot of people and save money that we can then spend on really helping those young women and adolescent girls. Back to you.
Yeah, thank you, Marelize. And I think these are really good examples, and just drive home the point that both of you touched on, which is it's not always the coolest thing that you see in a newspaper or a TV advertisement, right? But there is real value in AI. Like I was joking with my colleagues yesterday because a lot of the talk these days is generative AI. So I was saying, oh, the old school AI nobody talks about and nobody cares.
Yeah.
But a lot of these examples are, you could call it AI, you could call it, like what I call old school AI, but there's a lot of value in that as well, right? It's not always the shiniest object that really drives value necessarily, right? So again, this is again one of these areas where people have a lot of different experience. So I want to like tap into all of you for this question. So Manu, I know you've done a lot of work with international agency partners as well as government partners, right? Like, and you yourself a data scientist did AI work. Like, pick one example. It might be challenging for you, but go for it.
Yeah, just a few very quick examples, or so like really applications. So one is actually pretty recent. I haven't worked on it, but I just heard about it, and I thought it was. I haven't seen it in action, but it is the ability to predict diabetes through like retinal images using deep neural network. So I haven't seen it work, but I've been told that in regions where diabetes is very prevalent, the prediction capability is actually pretty high, and so that seems to be something that can have a very powerful impact, and it is also fit for purpose. So I think I just thought it was a good example. Other examples that I think have potential, but they're not yet very developed is, for instance, I have to do a bit of a, not product placement, but also talk about, my work. So at Data-POP Alliance, we're working with some UNDP country offices. For instance, in Morocco, we are trying to predict mental health from social media in adolescents. And so it's both difficult. There are lots of ethical questions that are, brought up, but I think it's those kinds of like newer fields in which I see good promise. And last, I would say a couple of years ago, we've also tried to work with actually Facebook data to understand like corruption. So under SDG 16, so you have those, let's say like less well measured SDGs and also the tier 2 SDGs that have to do with corruption, killings of journalists, so more like politically sensitive indicators where there's bad data. And so I think I see like pretty good potential in these more controversial areas.
Yeah, thank you. And Manu tends to be on the cutting side, a lot of advanced research oriented, which I think he and his teams love. So if you look him up, I think there are a lot of cool things that are hypotheses being tested out. Alexis, anything? I mean, you've been on both sides now. Maybe all sides now. Like, what would be your example?
Yeah, I think they're like specifically to the DEI lens, there are 3 that come to mind, and hopefully we'll have time for more because there's 3 others that I just love. But starting with the DEI ones, I think, to maybe Shachee's point, there's a lot of AI that's actually like quite well proven, quite usable, right? So, when I was working with state and local governments, first of all, just making sure something is available in someone's language right? And using that translation, like you can't say you care about DEI and not actually do your utmost, right, to give access to this information.
Yeah.
So, using some of those AI tools that exist is really a no-brainer, right? And it's not nearly as exotic, right, as it used to be, and it's much better and getting better every day. I think the second is actually we really underestimate the power of chatbot and the ability for people to do and interact with government or benefits or other types of services and value at a time that is convenient for them. So I had a very powerful experience when I was at Google, where we were helping during COVID, a lot of different counties, not only make sure that different diaspora groups or maybe non-English speakers had information that was translated, but more importantly, if you think about someone who has financial vulnerability, oftentimes, government programs or other types of assistance, maybe they have a call center, maybe they have something that's open, but it's usually only open from like 9 to 5, which is exactly when people who are already financially vulnerable are really probably trying to work, right? And so they can't necessarily afford to simply take hours out of the day to go to an office, to sit online waiting for a call center representative. And so it was amazing when we started putting in chatbots. It was actually amazing to see the spike in participation with that service that happened after hours, right? When someone might actually have a moment that they can take to kind of pursue information or pursue that benefit. And more importantly, we saw a huge spike in groups that were very financially vulnerable, and maybe on other types of assistance, but B, again, may not be English speaking or, and other types of things. So I think it's really important when we think about DE&I to kind of say, not everyone participates in the way that I can participate, and how might these tools actually make it easier? And when we're talking about 700 plus million cell phones in Africa, not everyone has same access, not everyone, and connectivity is still a challenge, but like, this is something we should really think about. And I would say the third is, also to the point of language and translation, as more and more of the generative AI, so the ChatGPTs, the Bards, et cetera, are mastering new language sets, I want us to think about what it means when all of a sudden, a lot of the information maybe from Korea or Japan, right, or other cultures or other things become more available to us, right? And how we might be able to have different levels of empathy, different understanding. I'll end on this, my favorite a little experience that I've been doing lately is I've been taking government, programmatic website information, right? Like you just simply apply in this way. And I've been putting it in Bard or ChatGPT and said, make this, accessible to someone who, has a 4th grade education, or just use simple language. And what's amazing is like how all of that complicated government wonk speak just becomes like pretty darn simple, right? And I've seen a lot of agencies actually take that and replace, right, some of their much more complicated kind of govy wonkness with much more human accessible language, because those tools are able to kind of put a refining lens on it in that way. So those are all just examples that I'm excited about.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. And Alexis, I think good point in terms of like a lot of these examples that I think the panel shared, they do touch upon different aspects of, diversity or equity and inclusion. And some of this, like at least the examples were positive examples where it could, right, increase equity, it could create more inclusivity. Having said that, I think all of us have experiences with engaging with bad chatbots sometimes, right? Like where they just don't respond to what you bid. And then I've also had experiences with some chatbots that were amazing, right? Like get the job done, feels good. And I think there are some comments also in the chat around, hey, sometimes the chatbots suck and that just leaves a bad impression. But I think there's potential there. I'll change the topic now. I think just focus more on that equity part, right? So again, as I've been thinking about doing work, talking to all of you, reading a lot of news, I've seen kind of both sides of it in terms of people arguing if some segments of community not represented in data, then they will be automatically excluded when the algorithms are trained. And then some arguments like the examples that were cited where, hey, that could actually increase equity, right? So my question is, in terms of role that the international development organizations like USAID, World Bank, others can play in ensuring that the AI solutions, right, that are part of the programs that are supported by these institutions, that they drive equitable results, right? Shachee, would you like to go first? I think would love to hear. I know you publish stuff from a USAID perspective, some examples. I would love to hear some examples as well as kind of how USAID is approaching that.
Yeah, absolutely, AD. And I mean, this is the core of it. I think I just don't think that we can continue to just be excited about AI without thinking about this issue of inclusion and equity, especially when we work in international development, especially when we work in places where there's already so many barriers to access and equity when it comes to digital stuff writ large. And so, you know, I just want to first say, like, we are all excited, like AI use is growing, right, across all of our work, across all of our sectors that we work in. But in my opinion, it's not growing equally, right? There are some sectors that are embracing it more, that it's been shown to be more useful for than others. And I don't know if there's a reason for that, but that would be worth discussing. So for example, like in global health, we've seen lots of great use cases of AI. In agriculture, we've seen lots of great uses of AI that have been going on now for, 5, 6, 7 years. This is not like new stuff anymore. And, whether it's like doing better diagnostics of remote diseases or better targeting treatment for patients like Marelize and I were talking about before, or for, in agriculture for better crop yield predictions, like how can we help farmers get better crops? Or even climate change related stuff, like how can we, look at weather patterns and get better insights on changing climate. And so, but it's heterogeneous. It's not going in the same pace across different sectors at the same time. And then the other heterogeneity that you were talking about is just kind of the pace at which this AI evolution is going to affect developing countries versus developed countries. It's not going to be the same pace because there are inherent inequities between the ecosystems in developed versus developing countries. And so you talked about it, right? Like data infrastructure is not the same when it comes to developed versus developing countries. In fact, if you look at the benchmark data sets, which are the sort of publicly available data sets that many of these large models, like the large language models we're talking about, other models too, image data sets are built on, are very disproportionately representative of the West, right? Of the US, of Europe, of some parts of Asia, and like Africa, even South Asia are like very minimally represented, Latin America. And so these models are very powerful and they're learning from the data that they're being fed on. And so if there's this data inequity, then we're going to continue to perpetuate offline inequities in online spaces, right? So that's one concern that we need to be very worried about. There's also a talent gap, right? There's just much less capacity available in lots of developing countries to be able to harness this AI revolution in the same way that we can do in other parts of the world, where there are tons of universities teaching courses now on AI, and it's very easy to get trained up, and there are lots of jobs available. And so that also is a hindrance. And then, of course, I think this is something that's global. Lots of governments are just grappling with how to govern AI, right? But there's still a discrepancy between countries where AI is a little bit more developed versus other places. It's just not, even data privacy is like just becoming a thing that people are learning to think about how to govern. So AI is still kind of further down. And then, and in addition to these sort of embedded structural differences between countries, there's the risk, the really very real risk of AI being used in a malign way, for purposes that none of us would think are good. So whether it's by malicious actors to create deep fakes or to perpetuate online, gender-based violence, or whether it's, the use of AI by authoritarian leading governments to use things like facial recognition to surveil and oppress minorities, for example. These are things that can become, if we're not careful, like widespread or even, kind of systematic, if we're not thinking about the ways in which we want to govern and use this technology. And so on that doomy and gloomy note, I kind of want to say, like, I mean, as an international development organization, we take all of these things very seriously. So we go at it with eyes wide open. And we want to make sure that any investments that we are making in AI are addressing these sort of fundamental structural inequalities. Like that's something that's in our control, and raising awareness about the ways that AI can be misused. So, you know, while like many of our colleagues are going to be laser focused on their like particular problem, whether they're working in agriculture or education, we need to look at like, what is the systematic problem in this particular country that we can like help address in addition through this project that we're working on. So to try to make that the ethos, like we have released an AI action plan at USAID, which charts out how we can be responsible stewards of this technology. And so, you know, it could be something like, how do we strengthen the data systems writ large in the project that we're working in, like not just in the project we're working in, but like beyond in the ecosystem. How do we, you know, make sure that there is a plan for governing this AI, right? Like it's not a technology that just you finish a project and it's done, right? It's going to be there. It's going to continue to learn and grow and iterate. How do we make sure that in the governance of it, we're thinking about protecting people's rights and we're protecting the data and ensuring that there's privacy built into it? So it's incumbent to ask ourselves these questions, and like that's the stage we're at right now, where we want to make sure that that is the lens through which we approach AI investments.
So thank you, Shachee. I love how you started macro and kind of filtered down, right? Would be, and we can come back to this, but I think Marelize, as you reflect on this, right, from a, and I was at the World Bank for my past life, as I say, right before I joined consulting, and I know World Bank takes all sorts of safeguards very seriously. So was also be very interested in seeing how the bank is approaching, you know, including AI, or if there are programs that banks financing or supporting has an AI element to it. Is there specific guidelines? Is there safeguards? Is there good practices? Like how is bank thinking about equity, right? If AI is part of a solution.
Yeah, it's a really, really important issue. And as you said, Adarsh, we have an environmental and social safeguards framework for every one of our projects, and ensuring that any data that are generated through World Bank projects is safeguarded, that there are data governance regulations in place is indeed a priority for us. We published, as you know, we publish a World Development Report every year. Our development report for 2021 was about data for better lives, and it's really all about this notion of how do we better govern data and what consent mechanisms need to be put in place to really use this data well. So on the safeguards and protection side, absolutely, that's definitely a priority. I would argue, though, on the inverse side, that I sometimes find these discussions about AI and DEI to be very technocratic in nature, in that we tend to focus on, you know, an imbalance in data that's available to train the models. And whereas that is absolutely an issue, I think it is one dimension of a much bigger issue, right? Which is, and one of the questions in the chat allude to this, right? First and foremost, yes, we need to ensure the data is well governed, but I think we need to start with a more fundamental question, which is what is the value that this particular technology is going to add in this particular country, right? And if we can't clearly identify the value, and I don't think we have a language or a framework to think about value in AI. We just published a framework as we're working with our colleagues in the Development Economics Group on how to do economic evaluations in digital health and in AI, because we don't have a language to speak about this yet and to really identify what is value, because we need to start with value for people and then build out from there. I think the other aspect that to me is fundamental to the DEI and AI conversation is around trust and preference. Just because there's an AI version of a digital X-ray reading device available doesn't mean that people prefer that technology or that they will trust the outcomes that comes from an AI medical-based device versus the outcomes that comes from a radiologist that actually read and looked at a digital X-ray to determine if somebody has TB. And so I think if we really want to build in a comprehensive way better equity, we need to focus on these perspectives. We need to focus on what are people's preferences, on knowledge, attitudes, and practices about this new technology, right? In other words, build technology. Yes, when we build technology, we need to think about people, process, and technology, but start with people, the value that we can add, building trust, and not having technocratic solutions that we just in a cookie cutter way apply from one context to another. And of course, all of that in a framework and environment of linked interoperable data that is well protected through very strong governance mechanisms. I think those are elements of a recipe to really get the DEI conversation in AI for us to focus beyond the representation of the training data. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. I love how, having an expansive view on this thing is so important. There's a specific question from the audience that I love for Manu to answer. But before that, Alexis, any reactions to what you just heard? Anything you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, so much richness in this conversation so far. And it makes me think about a couple things that I would just highlight. I think one of the things that's really interesting is, as I have been working with a lot of different development players, that question about privacy or security come up a lot. And I think what's an interesting maybe point to reflect on is that, ironically, the industries that are most advanced in AI are also the industries that are the most highly regulated. So healthcare, finance, et cetera. And so I think it's important that people understand that there are solutions to issues like privacy and security when you have the most heavily regulated industries on earth that are the most forward-leaning, right? And so sometimes in development, we can tend to focus on these things as a reason to not do something or try something. And I would instead say, well, how have these industries that have already navigated it, negotiated that? I also think, that one of the things that was really interesting that Shachee raised, which I think is spot on, is you do have a talent gap. I also think there's an interesting talent opportunity, meaning that with a focus, for example, at USAID on localization, quite frankly, not everyone, from Africa will write maybe a response to an RFP as kind of beautifully crafted, maybe as Deloitte does, Adarsh. And so in some ways, I do see the ability to take something, to put it into a generative AI and to say, hey, make this better, clean this up, make this something that will be better received, right? And just have better English or something, if that's the case, is actually a huge opportunity, right? It really is an opportunity to level the playing field a little bit more, to bring different tools that didn't exist. And those tools are becoming more user-friendly than ever as well. So I think we're going to see a lot more use of those. Another one that I think I'll give two more quick reflections. Another one is that when we think about equitable, I think it's important to not always think that equitable means the same, right? And so as an example, we had a really cool use of AI in responding to a hurricane, where parts of government were able to understand who was already financially vulnerable, right? Who might be getting food assistance or housing assistance and kind of already known to the state or the local government as being financially vulnerable. And of course, someone who's financially vulnerable is going to be even more vulnerable, right, when confronted with disaster. But additionally, there was information over on a very unlikely partner source, right, kind of the zoning and permitting office, who really had no reason to ever talk to the benefits people. But the zoning and permitting actually had information about physical vulnerability, right? If someone lived in a mobile home versus, a concrete block house, et cetera. And usually those two groups wouldn't see any mission alignment, right? And then finally, you had data like, what were low-lying areas, topographic, that would be more likely to be flooded. And then finally, the path of the hurricane. So to me, I think it's a really, in that case, we were able to take all of those, and you can imagine when you overlay all of that data, you can actually see who's really, really in trouble, right? Because if you meet all of those parameters, you are much more in trouble than maybe someone who only meets one. And in that case, we were able to literally text message $700 the day of the hurricane directly to those people, right? And so I do think that, it's important that when we think about equity, we also think about this amazing, these amazing tools and the ability to layer in data, right, to allow us to use the best discretion, to Marelize's point, maybe that idea of really honing resources in a way where, they're needed most. And the final point that I would make is that, there's understandably a lot of concern about AI propagating bias, right? And so people will avoid using it because they're worried that the AI will be biased. Let me tell you, the AI is not necessarily the bias. It is likely your program was already biased, right? And so one of the things that I found to be really powerful is to sit with different public leaders and to say, well, let's actually use the AI to look at what you've been doing for the last 20 years, actually understand how you might be starting at a biased place, and then and use the AI to uncover that, right? Accept it, and then use it to say, okay, well, now that we know that, how are we going to be intentional about that algorithm being different? Or how are we going to be intentional, quite frankly, about our policy being different, right? Or our program being different. So I always encourage people, starting with AI doesn't always mean starting to have it do something. You can start it as a way of reflecting on what you've been doing and kind of have a little bit of a mirror effect, right? Of having to look in that mirror and saying, what is this telling me about our past practice and what might it mean for our ability to change our future practice?
Yeah, no, love it. And I think invariably when you talk about AI, the bias comes in. And I think it's a great point, Alexis. Sometimes the bias is in the history and the data that you already have, and maybe this is time to reflect and change it. And Manu, I'm going to go to you to talk about specifically about you've done a lot of the AI execution research work, right? And you deal with this all the time, right? So we have 10 minutes to go, and I know you could probably write a paper on this, but very succinctly, right? Like how do you think, like, are there practical ways of addressing bias when you are building an AI solution? Can you talk about some tips or some things that you've used in your work?
Yeah, sure. So I try to be below 2 minutes. So, I mean, first, of course, it's not very new, the question of bias in data sets. In the case of the first instances of using kind of like big data. So let's take the example of the earthquake in Haiti in 2010. So there was this whole controversy about the fact that you actually got a pretty bad signal if you looked at cell phone data, because it's actually where people were still alive and where you had cell towers, and you had the same after the tsunami in Japan. And so this is a case of attrition or sample sample bias. So these questions have been internal, external validities have been going around for a long time. At this time, we said, well, basically you have to be a sophisticated user. That was the term that people used. So you have to be a master of the data and not be just blinded by the data and think, well, I have big N, I have lots of signals, so therefore I need to send my tracks there, and so on and so forth. When we do machine learning, when we develop models, for instance, to predict, estimate things like gender-based violence or crime, the target variable that we use is biased by nature. So there is underreporting, but the underreporting is not random. And so it is going to be where women have fewer access or less social capital and so on and so forth that it will report, and crime is the same. So how to address that? You can either be rule-based. And so, for example, people like Emilio Zagheni, Igmar Weber have written a paper over 10 years ago about how to try to come up with a sample bias correction based on just hypotheses of internet penetration and things like that. Or you can do ground truthing, where you use mixed methods, where you try to ask women, for instance. So you take a DHS and you think it's your demographic and health survey. You think it's your ground truth, but it might not be. And so you try to compare that. But I think the main message is we have to be mindful of the fact that it's not that the data is necessarily lying, but that it's only a prism for which you see like human reality, and you can get it wrong. And so I think we have to be very careful about the kinds of decisions that we make. At some point, as in the case of COVID, you have to make a decision. You don't have all the facts, you don't have all the data. You make guesses, but they have to be pretty, I would say, well, educated. I mean, I could go on, as you say, but we have 6 minutes, so I'll just stop here for now. Well, or
yeah, thank you. So I would like to squeeze in a couple more questions, one about government, one about private sector. Just want to recognize that we had some polling going on with the audiences, and I'm told that it's working. And I see some interesting polling results, right? I think we have a more optimistic audience today. I think a lot of people say AI is going to have either significant or transformational impact on international development. Majority of people say that. But then there's also a poll about, is government ready, right, to regulate AI? And the answer is unequivocally no. So I want to just use that as a segue into my next topic is, role of government, right? There's a lot of debate even today, right? Like including in United States about, generative AI and the role of government. Want to start with Shachee. You are in the government today. What do you think should be the role of the government? Should the government stay out of it and let the private sector innovate, or is there somewhere that the government, there needs to be more regulation than what we've had so far? And again, looking at your experience at the international development at governments in other countries, love to hear if you can be brief. So I want to cover a couple of more questions. But Shachee, please.
Yeah, I'll try to be really brief. So yeah, AD, I think government has a very important role to play, I think, when it comes to how we want AI. I think we have lots of decisions to make, right? All of our wonderful panelists have raised lots of great points about the issues related to inclusion and equity and the importance of people, right? Like, even though we're talking about automation here. And governments are one of those people that can play a very important role in making sure that we are getting out of AI what we want to, and not perpetuating the harms that we're worried about. So I think the very first thing that governments can do is lead by setting a tone, right? Like what it is that we want to accomplish here at the end, so that it's very clear to people where we want to go with AI, right? So, I mean, in the US, we've had the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights, right? Like, how do we want to think of AI in the context of rights that we expect people to have? We've also put out an AI risk management framework, right? So how do we want our private sector colleagues and anybody who's innovating with AI to think about risk? How do we want our other government agencies to think about the risks of AI and be able to manage them? I think there was a great question in the chat about when should we be checking, right? How often should we be checking whether AI is perpetuating? And I think all the time, that's what Alexis was saying too. It's like, this is not a technology you can just put out there and stop. And so what governments need to do is provide those guidelines for when exactly should you be checking? How often? How risky is your project so that, it requires more checking than in other cases? So there are things that we can put in place. They don't have to be very onerous regulations, but they can be certain requirements that we expect that AI adheres to. And so it can be things like audit checks. It can be things like underlying data set checks. It can be things like feedback from the community to get responses from how AI is interacting with them, so that AI can be retested and retrained. There are many things like that. There are tools already in place. I think audits are a really great way to start, so that we can sort of create this ethos of transparency. That's what's lacking. Sometimes I feel people feel like AI is this big black box thing, and the models themselves can be. But I think the role governments can play is trying to make it so that AI tools can be accountable and fair. And there are tools to make that happen through these kinds of audit processes and bias check processes.
Thank you. 2 minutes to go. Want to squeeze in one more question, but I want to have a quick rebuttal from Manu. You have a slightly different perspective on how in the point of regulation from a democracy versus countries that don't necessarily have a thriving democracy. You want to just 30 seconds, Manu. You'd love to hear your take.
Yeah, I mean, it's very hard in 30 seconds not to be, oversimplistic. I mean, it's a gradient, but yeah, I mean, I think we have to be aware of the fact that, often we go for technical solutions when the problems are more political than they are, technological. One example is the earthquakes in Turkey and Syria recently. All tech companies went and provided data, and you can do amazing things looking at where people are and mobility patterns and and data scientists flooding stuff. But the reason, I mean, they're not natural disasters; they're man-made disasters. The reason why these buildings, fell down is because of corruption. And so the question is, okay, you have all these tools. okay, how is it going to change the very deep root causes of A, B, C, D, E, where A, B, C, D, E is climate change, gender-based violence, crime, poverty, inequality, and these are very political. So, I mean, it would take much more than the 5 seconds that I have left to unpack this, but I think we have to keep that in mind, that deep down, the reasons why we see these problems has to do with the way humans behave. That's very political, and it's usually men, not always, but usually.
Well, I think we are at time. I tried my best to squeeze in more question, but the topic that people are so passionate, didn't feel like I want to cut anybody off. So I know we didn't get through some of these things. Maybe it's I don't know, another conversation that we'll have in the future on this. Just thank you, Alexis, Manu, Shachee, Marelize. Keep doing what you're doing. I think we need people like you who can both push the innovation in the international development government space, but at the same time bring a eyes wide open, realistic view on where the risks are, and make sure that there are enough safeguards. I do want to say that there was some follow-up from the audience saying, hey, I selected AI is going to have significant impact, but I wasn't sure if it's all going to be good, right? So there's probably a bias in how I interpreted the data, but I think there's a lot of positives that AI could drive, but I think we'll have to have a very pragmatic, practical approach to make sure that it doesn't create more inequities, rather it becomes a bridge and provides access to better lives to more people. So with that, I'm going to close this panel. Again, thank you, the audience, for joining, for all your questions. I appreciate everybody, and hopefully we'll continue this dialogue online, social media. You can find all of us on LinkedIn. So thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.